This examination lesson will be an examination of whether or not literary characters were real or fiction. You will be exploring literature using historic evidence. Your assignment for today is to use my model lesson. I will be examining Romeo and Juliet. Were Romeo and Juliet, the two famous literary characters, purely fiction or possibly based on true people who lived in the past? Your assignment will be, what do you think is the probability that Disney princesses were based on real people from history? So, we will be examining the evidence. I will be illustrating the evidence of how Romeo and Juliet, were they real lovers? There are several potential pairs of star-crossed lovers. The first recorded example is Mariotto and Genoso, and this is the earliest recorded version of the story that's considered to be an inspiration for Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. It appears in Il Novellino, which was published after his death in 1476. The story of Mariotto and Genosa appears in the 33rd section of the book, and all major plot evidence in the story are obvious. Salartino refers to the stories of Mariotto and Genosa as people who lived in the time and claimed their story was true. Historians agree that at least it seems quasi or partially historical personalities existed. This is an example of different characters but the same love. A later version by Luigi da Porto transfers the events to Verona, renames the lovers Romeo and Julietta, getting far closer to Shakespeare's heroic characters, and specifies a feud between the Monticelli and the Capuletti, again very close to the names used in Shakespeare's book. Again, the ending is different, with Juliet awakening in time to talk to Romeo and then committing suicide by holding her breath. There is another likely couple. This couple was known actually by Shakespeare. During Shakespeare's time, a couple fell in love and fell under the Queen's disfavor. This was because they were both very powerful Catholic families, and their union would be a direct threat to the Protestant monarchy. So the story goes something like this. A young nobleman's father died, left him in the care of his patroon or caretaker named Cecil. The young man, Southampton, was well read and loved poetry and art. He was also a friend of Shakespeare, who was also a friend of the Queen. It would be natural then for Shakespeare to model his Romeo, House of Montague, after his friend Southampton, from the Montague family. Southampton refused to marry into an arranged marriage because he fell in love with a woman named Elizabeth Vernon, who was a lady-in-waiting to the Queen. Back in that time, if you were a lady-in-waiting, you had to get permission from the Queen for anything. The Queen forbade the marriage, but they were united anyway. It is reasonable to assume that Southampton and Elizabeth Vernon may have made a wedding promise or a secret vow to each other, much like Romeo and Juliet promised their love to one another and marry in secret. After Cecil's death in 1598, the couple did marry, but when the Queen discovered their union, they were both sent to Fleet Prison, a less tragic ending than the play, but still consistent with the concept of star-crossed lovers. The couple were never again in the Queen's favor, and in 1601 Southampton, with his dear friend the Earl of Essex, plotted to overthrow the monarch. Probably got tired of being away from his lady. The rebellion failed, Essex was executed, and Southampton was sentenced again to death, but was sent to prison instead, again, for 2 years. He was released after the Queen died in 1603. Elizabeth and Southampton were reunited and lived happily until his death 21 years later. On another note, their daughter Penelope married William Spencer, the second Baron Spencer, making her a relation to Lady Diana Spencer, who was the late Princess of Wales. So, was Romeo and Juliet a gift from Shakespeare to Southampton and Elizabeth Vernon when they promised their love to each other? The play was written about the right time and just when these events were unfolding. So, looking at those days, in those days, suicide was a one-way trip to hell. Nobody was allowed to speak of them, mourn for them, honor them. These were devoutly Christian times, with fundamental beliefs in right and wrong. So, nobody who was found to have committed suicide would be given a Christian burial in hallowed grounds and would not be honored. That makes this next section all the more interesting. In Juliet's house in Verona, there is a place called Juliet's House. It's actually a 13th century inn which was purchased by the city in 1936. It was restored to the Gothic style with a balcony. The house has a nice exhibit inside which includes a bed and 2 costumes of the film version by Franco Zeffirelli. And the balcony provides a great place for photo ops. However, it is doubtful that the Capulettis ever set foot in there. Additionally, the statue of Juliet in the courtyard is rubbed for good luck, and visitors leave locks in the courtyard, a practice that has been spreading around the world, especially now on bridges. This is actually the tomb of Giulietta. Juliet's tomb, located again in Venice in the former convent of San Francesco, Corsico. In 1930s, the city of Verona restored a red marble sarcophagus and placed it in the convent's small, dark crypt and attributed it to Juliet. The tomb has been visited by the likes of Byron, Heine, and Dickens. The reason this is important is, again, remember, back in those days, even in the early 1900s, suicide was definitely not viewed very well, and it was basically a trip to hell. In Verona's sites, they have other plaques which have inscriptions with quotes from the play. For example, where the duel happened, where Romeo took revenge for Mercutio's death, and also where Romeo was banished from Verona. So there is documentation and at least one justifiable couple. It is logical, therefore, to assume that they lived in history. So, as Shakespeare penned Romeo and Juliet between 1591 and 1596, the exact date isn't known. More than 100 years later, there is ample time for the tale to work its way into folklore and travel to England. It's very evident that the story of Romeo and Juliet existed almost in its entirety before Shakespeare wrote his immortal lines. So it is logical to assume that they lived in history. It appears, therefore, that Romeo and Juliet may have lived, loved, and died, though we don't know the exact historic details of the passionate lovers' lives.